and welcome to the WIHS Journal Public Affairs program. I'm Jerry Williams. Join me now for part 2 of author Eric Metaxas speaking at the Family Institute of Connecticut's annual gala at the AquaTurf. Happening now on the WIHS Journal, it's news and public affairs.
What it is now, for example, you know that if we lose this election, it's over. Now, I'm not saying that to say, it's the most important election. It is genuinely over. We're in an existential crisis. We've not been in an existential crisis since yes. Now, the point, of course, is that if we are able to prevail in November, that's crossing the starting line. That's not the finish line, right? I think what we've learned is that it's not enough to elect a candidate or two. Because we've been sliding for decades and decades and decades. It's up to the church ultimately to do God's work, but we need political support. We need those people. So that's just part of it, is the political thing. But the story of Bonhoeffer, as I say, I could sort of sense when I was writing it, this is coming to us. The last few years, the reason I wrote Letter to the American Church, I could see it's happening. Now, when I say it's happening, I want to be very clear. I say in the new book, Religionless Christianity, the sequel to Letter to the American Church, that we're in the third existential crisis of our history, right? So you have the Revolution, you have the Civil War, and you have where we are now. All the other struggles in our history have not been existential crises, right? The Spanish-American War, the Korean War, even World War II for America was not an existential crisis. We are in an existential crisis. We're at a point where the forces of atheistic, globalistic Marxism, just to name 3 parts of this monster, are arrayed against us in a way that we could lose it forever, what we have. This is not just, you lose an election, right? But the point is that much of the church is not fighting as though that's true. Now, I know many of you who are here are fighting as though that's true. But the reason I'm bringing this up, and the reason I wrote Letter to the American Church, is because the parallel with what happened in Bonhoeffer's day is precisely that it was the church in Germany in the 30s that had the ability to stand against the evil of the Nazis. There's no doubt that the church in Germany had the cultural power to stand against the evil of the Nazis. And Bonhoeffer, a prophetic figure, tried to get them to stand against the evil of the Nazis. And we know that he failed. We know that he failed. And why didn't they stand? Well, they had religious excuses. What's more demonic than religious excuses for serving the devil? Well, I just want to be real clear. The reason I wrote Letter to the American Church is because the parallel to what happened then is that the same excuses have been given today by many, many pastors. And I would guess that a number of you in this room go to churches that are looking the other way. A number of you in this room go to churches, and God forbid, tithe to churches that are looking the other way. And the hour right now is so late that I promise you, if you really understood how late the hour was, you would run from those churches. For the sake of your soul, you would run from those churches. Because to look the other way at a time when God is calling you to stand and fight is satanic. But the point is that the church acts like, we have a religious carve-out. We just want to preach the gospel. We don't get involved in politics. So I say this because that's precisely what the German church did. I'll give you some figures. In 1933, as you know, Hitler took power, right? He was elected, right? He didn't take power by force. He was elected by people deceived into thinking that he might be a good choice. They had no idea what they were doing. And I want to be real clear is that oftentimes we do terrible things out of simple ignorance. We don't do it because we're malevolent or because we want evil to rise. On the contrary, we just make mistakes. So people make mistakes, and God is a gracious God. But in Germany in 1933, Hitler takes power and almost instantly begins to implement Nazi doctrine throughout the culture at lightning speed. Lightning speed. And this is the thing. The Nazis had power, and with lightning speed, they begin to take over the culture. But the tipping point for Bonhoeffer was that the Nazi attitude, and this is the attitude of anybody who believes in a big state, right? Whether it's Nazis, fascists, communists, anybody who doesn't believe what Americans believe, right? In the sanctity of the individual, in freedom, that we the people could govern ourselves, that we're free to govern ourselves, no one will govern us. Anybody who doesn't believe in that is ultimately at war with God and the people of God, because God and the people of God answer to a higher authority than the state. And so anyone who wants to take over a culture, to take over a society, will eventually go to war with the people of God, because the people of God will answer to God and not the state. Why does the Chinese Communist government persecute the Uyghur Muslims? It's not just Christians. Why do they persecute the Uyghur Muslims in an evil way? Because the Uyghur Muslims believe in something beyond the Chinese Communist government. And that is a threat to the Chinese Communist government. So anytime you have fascists, communists, as I say, anybody who believes in the state as God, ultimately, they're eventually going to go to war with those who believe in some kind of actual God. That's just the way it is, whether it's the Jews or the serious Christians. So when Hitler took power, it was, of course, his job not to wake up the church to what he was doing, right? Isn't that the goal? You're not stupid. Satan appears as an angel of light. He's not going to advertise, I'm evil, follow me. He's going to try to fool you into thinking he's good. And that's what the enemy does all the time. And so you're seeing this in the political process. Lots of blather, lots of talking about like we're on the same page. We want to close the border. Oh, right. Yeah, you want to do all that good stuff. The point is that people who are interested in power, they're not interested in transparency and clarity. So Hitler knew that his goal is to take over the church, but he has to do it very quietly. He has to do it in such a way. The image that I always think of is Gulliver. In Gulliver's Travels, you think of Gulliver being tied down by the Lilliputians, right? And how do they do it? He's sleeping. So if the church is sleeping, right, it's like Gulliver is being tied down by, I don't know if it's dental floss or whatever it is. It's something, it's not very significant, but he's sleeping, and the tiny Lilliputians, they're doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it. If he wakes up at any moment, he can crush them. So they just want him to keep sleeping just a couple of more minutes, because at some point, it's not being done with twine. With the Nazis, it was being done with legislation, right? In our world, it's being done with legislation, rules. At some point, if the church wakes up, boom, it's too late. You can't move now. You're tied down. At some point, it's over. That is precisely what the Nazis knew, and it's precisely what Bonhoeffer knew. He was trying to wake up the church because he knew the window was closing. So in 1933, Hitler takes over. They write the Barmen Declaration. Some of you know the story. The Barmen Declaration was those pastors that said, wait a minute, we need to take a stand. We need to write this declaration that makes it clear that a Christian's fidelity is to Jesus. It is not to the state. So we love the state, we're patriotic Germans, but at the end of the day, our fidelity is not to the Führer, but to Jesus Christ. And they write this out, and they clarify the whole thing. And there were about 18,000 Lutheran pastors in Germany at the time, and maybe 5,000 or 6,000 signed it. Kind of brave, right? You think, well, what about the others? Well, forget about the others for a minute. Of those 5,000 or 6,000, by the time you get to 1935, the Nazis had been so effective in bullying and canceling and threatening. They didn't need to use the FBI. They had the Gestapo. They did what they needed to do so that by the time you get to 1935, only 3,000 of the 18,000 were standing strong. This is the key. And Bonhoeffer knew that if only maybe 6,000 of the 18,000 were standing strong, they could have stood against the Nazis. But the Nazis bullied and bullied. So if you think about it, you have about 3,000 standing strong, saying, we believe what we claim to believe. We believe Jesus defeated death on the cross. We actually believe that, therefore we don't fear death. If you're a Christian who fears death, you're actually not a Christian. We're supposed to believe that God is so real that it doesn't even require anything for me to be courageous. It's like idiotic for me not to be courageous. I'm betting on a sure thing. And you find out what people really believe when things get tough.
And that was author Eric Metaxas speaking at the Family Institute of Connecticut's annual gala at the AquaTurf. If you would like more information about what you heard today, call WIHS 860-346-1049, 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily of those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Jerry Williams for the WIHS Journal. It's news and public affairs.